Do you know how much money I give to this hospital? The sound of the slap was louder than the hospital machines. It was a sharp, wrong sound that did not belong in a place for healing. Annie shook as she stepped back. She put one hand on her red, bruised cheek and the other over her 7-month-old baby. In the busy ICU, everything stopped. No one moved, not the doctors in their white coats and not the other nurses. While Annie's eyes filled with tears, Sio Gene Wu just fixed his expensive sleeve like nothing had happened. He did not know the doors were about to open. He did not know a man was walking in who would make him forget how to breathe. The ICU never slept and always smelled like strong medicine. It was a place where every second mattered and every choice had a big consequence. Annie Dello knew this better than anyone. She had worked 12-hour shifts for 6 years and was now 7 months pregnant. She was the person who stayed calm when everyone else panicked. Annie never talked about her family or her real last name. She worked hard in her blue scrubs to build a good life away from the dark world she grew up in. But some shadows do not stay away. The billionaire standing in her way only saw a nurse who was alone and weak. He had no idea that the name Dio was a name people only whispered in fear. He had no idea who her brother was. The ICU never truly slept, and for Annie Dello, that was exactly why she loved it. The air always smelled like strong soap and medicine, a smell that meant every second was important and every choice could save a life. Annie had spent 6 years walking these halls, usually during long 12-hour shifts that left her bones aching. At 7 months pregnant, the shifts felt even longer. Her feet throbbed with a deep pain that a cup of coffee couldn't fix, and her scrubs didn't fit quite right anymore. Still, she was the first person the doctors called when things went wrong because she never panicked. Annie reached up and touched the small plastic badge clipped to her chest. It read Annie Dello, charge nurse. Every time she saw it, she felt a quiet sense of pride. To the doctors and other nurses, she was just a hard-working woman who had built her career from nothing. They didn't know that Dello was a name she had made up when she was 22 years old. They didn't know that her real last name was Dio, a name that made powerful men in this city turn pale and talk in whispers. She had grown up in a world of dark shadows and dangerous secrets. Her family had enough money to buy the entire hospital, but Annie didn't want that life. She wanted a life she built with her own hands and her own sacrifices. Her brother, Malik, was the only one who knew her secret. He was a powerful man who lived in those shadows, but he respected Annie's choice to be independent. They had a deal. He would never show up at her job, and she would only call him if it was a true emergency. Annie tucked her badge back against her chest, a habit she had developed to keep the Dio name hidden. She hadn't called the numbers saved under the letter in her phone for 4 years, and she didn't plan to start today. She had 3 hours left on her shift and a stubborn patient in room 11 who needed her care. As she walked toward the next room, her daughter moved inside her with a slow, gentle roll. Annie smiled and touched her stomach. This life was hers, and she had worked too hard to let anything from her past touch it. She was Annie Dello, a nurse who asked for nothing but to do her job. How should the staff react when they first noticed the tension between Annie's quiet work life and the sudden arrival of the billionaire? At 2:09 p.m., the elevator at the end of the hall dinged with a sharp, clear sound. Annie did not look up from her charts at first, but she heard a voice that expected the entire world to stop. "I don't wait," the man said. 3 large, quiet men stepped off the elevator first, moving around their employer like parentheses around something valuable. These were not hospital guards. They were something much more dangerous. Then came the 4th man, Sio Gene Wu. Every person in the city knew his face because it was on the side of 2 massive buildings downtown. He wore a dark, perfectly cut suit that cost more than Annie's yearly rent, and his expensive watch caught the light as he moved toward the desk. He walked straight to the nurse's station where Priya, a young nurse with only 4 months of experience, was standing. Priya was not prepared for a man like this. "I need a room," Gene Wu said firmly. "Now." Priya blinked in surprise and tried to explain that the ICU only admits the most critical patients, but he cut her off. He placed his right hand flat on the counter, showing a clean white bandage wrapped around his palm. It looked like a simple kitchen cut, something that could be fixed in minutes at a normal clinic, not in a room meant for people fighting for their lives. Annie walked over with slow, steady steps. She always moved this way when she knew something was about to go wrong. Mr. Gene Wu, she said, her voice remaining calm and professional. I'm Annie Dello, the charge nurse on this floor. Can I take a look at that? Gene Wu turned to look at her, but he didn't really see a person. He looked at her badge, then at her 7-month pregnant belly, and finally at a spot that wasn't even her face. In just 2 seconds, he decided she was someone who didn't matter. To him, she was just a soft, alone, and unprotected nurse. I want a room with a door, he demanded, his eyes turning cold. Private. And I want a doctor, not a nurse. He pointed his finger directly at room 6. Annie knew that room held Mr. Okafor, a 67-year-old man whose heart had stopped twice in the last day. He was alive only because Annie and her team had stayed by his side every minute. Gene Wu looked at Annie like she was just a door that wouldn't open for him. He had no idea who her brother was, and he had no idea that Annie was the last person who would ever move a dying man for a billionaire's scratched hand. Annie stepped between Gene Wu and the door of room 6 without even thinking. She didn't make a big scene or give a long speech. She simply stood her ground. That room is occupied, she said, her voice remaining calm and steady. The man inside had a cardiac arrest. He is in critical condition and cannot be moved. Gene Wu looked at her with a mix of confusion and annoyance. He looked at her the way someone looks at a door that refuses to open. Move him somewhere else, he said, his voice flat. Annie shook her head. She explained that every single bed on the floor was filled with someone fighting to stay alive. She told him that his hand only needed a few stitches and that the air downstairs could finish the job in 20 minutes. The silence in the hallway grew heavy, like the air right before a thunderstorm. Gene Wu's 3 men didn't move, but the feeling in the room shifted. Slowly, Wu reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. He leaned over the counter, wrote a number with many zeros, and turned the check around so Annie could see it. This is for whatever fund needs it most, he said. All I want is that room for 1 hour. Annie looked at the check, but she didn't see the money. She saw Mr. Okafor's daughter, who had driven 4 hours to get to the hospital and was now sitting in the family room hoping for a miracle. Annie looked Gene Wu in the eye. I'm not moving him, she said softly but firmly. Not for that number. Not for any number. She had drawn a line that money could not cross. Gene Wu capped his pen and set it down on the check. The look in his eyes went completely flat, which was much scarier than if he had started shouting. You have no idea what you just did, he whispered. Annie didn't move an inch. She felt her baby move inside her and held his gaze. Neither do you, she replied. How will the other staff members react now that the billionaire's threat has become personal? Annie entered Dr. Harlan Cole's office, but he would not meet her eyes. He had been the chief of medicine for 11 years and was very good at firing people, even though he did not enjoy it. He looked at his desk and his hands, looking anywhere but at Annie's face. What happened on the floor today? He asked, his voice low. He hit me, Annie said plainly. He hit a pregnant nurse in the middle of the ICU in front of 6 witnesses. Dr. Cole nodded slowly, but he did not offer her any comfort. Instead, he slid a single page across the desk toward her. He explained that Sio Gene Wu's legal team had already contacted the hospital board. They were lying about the incident, saying that Annie had been aggressive and had refused to give care. Annie could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had only been doing her job and protecting a patient who was fighting for his life. I understand that, Dr. Cole said, finally looking up. Annie could see in his eyes that he knew she was right, but he was too afraid to help her. But his donations pay for 40% of this floor's operating budget. The board met an hour ago, and they have made a decision. The paper on the desk was a termination notice. It said her job was over effective immediately because of an investigation into her conduct. Annie felt a deep coldness in her chest. She had given 6 years of her life to this hospital, and now they were using her own dedication as a weapon against her. She did not sign the paper and she did not touch it. She simply stood up and walked back to the ICU one last time to collect what belonged to her. Her hands were shaking as she emptied her locker. She took a spare pair of shoes, a cardigan she kept for cold nights, and the small photo of her and her mother from the day she became a nurse. Priya tried to speak to her in the hallway, but Annie gently shook her head. She was not ready to talk. Security guards walked her to the front entrance. They were professional and looked sorry for what was happening, but they had to follow the rules. When the glass doors slid open, the cold, heavy rain hit Annie's face immediately. She stood on the top step, clutching a paper bag against her chest. Her 7-month-old baby pressed against her ribs from the inside, the only person she had left to protect. She had given the hospital 6 years, and it had given her a paper bag in the rain. She did not look back as she began the long walk home. Annie made it home before she finally stopped moving. She set the paper bag on the kitchen counter and took off her wet shoes. For a long time, she just stood in the middle of her apartment in her wet socks, not doing anything at all. Outside, the rain tapped against the window, and the refrigerator hummed in the quiet room. The rest of the world kept going as if nothing was wrong, but for Annie, everything had changed. She checked her phone out of habit. There were 3 missed calls from a number she did not know. She also had a voicemail from a lawyer who worked for Sio Gene Wu's company. She didn't listen to it because she already knew it would be bad news. Instead, she opened her banking app, and her heart almost stopped. Both her main account and her savings account were frozen. A message on the screen said there was a legal hold due to the investigation into her work conduct. Sio Gene Wu was using her own words against her like a weapon. He was not just taking her job. He was trying to take away her ability to survive. Annie sat down on the hard kitchen floor. She leaned her back against the cabinet and pulled her knees up to her chest. She placed one hand on her stomach, feeling her baby move. Her mind began to race through the numbers. Her rent was due in only 9 days. She had a doctor's appointment for the baby on Thursday. When she reached into her coat pocket, she found only $40 in cash. In the cupboard above the stove, there was only a half-empty box of crackers. The apartment was very dark because she hadn't turned on any lights. In the shadows, she thought about her mother and the way she used to hold Annie's face when things were difficult. Her mother used to say, "You are not alone, baby. You are never alone." But as Annie sat on the floor in the dark, she felt more alone than she ever had in her life. Her phone was still in her hand, the screen glowing in the darkness. She scrolled past many names she hadn't called in months, looking for the only person who could help her now. Who is the one person Annie feels she can truly turn to when her world is falling apart? Annie stared at the single letter on her glowing phone screen. She had carried this number with her for 4 years, ever since her mother's funeral. Malik had handed it to her like a secret weapon, telling her she never had to use it unless she truly had to. She had tried so hard to be independent, to be a nurse who didn't need a powerful last name to protect her. But as she sat on the kitchen floor in the dark, she knew her independence wasn't enough to fight a billionaire like Sio Gene Wu. She thought about her frozen bank accounts and the rent she could no longer pay. Just then, her baby kicked hard against her ribs. It was a strong, insistent movement, like the baby was telling her it was time to fight back. Annie took one more breath and finally pressed the call button. It rang only once before her brother answered. Across the city, the silence began to break. In a dark parking structure 2 floors below the ICU, 7 black cars had been idling since early afternoon, their engines humming like a warning. They were not waiting for the police or the hospital board, they were waiting for Malik Dio. The man in the dark coat, who had watched from the shadows of the hospital hallway for 11 minutes, finally put his phone away. He had seen everything, the slap, the fallen papers, and the way the billionaire had turned his back on Annie as if she were nothing. He had already sent the first message to Malik, but Annie's call was the final signal. Now, the shadows that Annie had tried to outrun were moving through the city with surgical precision. Men who did things that could not be written down began to gather. Sio Gene Wu thought he was the most powerful man in the room, but he was about to learn that some shadows don't just wait, they strike. The Dio name was finally being whispered again, and this time, it was not for a hospital badge. Sio Gene Wu woke up at 6 a.m. to a sound he had never heard before, the constant buzzing of his phone. He looked at the screen and saw 17 missed calls. His head of finance, his legal team, and several board members were all trying to reach him at the same time. Something was very wrong. He sat up in bed and opened his trading app. His heart dropped as he stared at the red numbers on the screen. Gene Wu Holdings was down 31% in a single night. There was no news story or market event that could explain such a huge loss. It was as if his wealth had simply evaporated while he slept. Desperate, Gene Wu opened his laptop to check his offshore accounts. These were 4 private accounts spread across 3 different countries, hidden from the public. He stared at the screen, but there were no numbers to see. Every account was empty. They had been zeroed out with a cleanliness that felt surgical. There were no records of transfers and no error messages, just white space where his millions used to be. He was still in his robe when his head of security knocked and walked in without being told to. This was the first sign that Gene Wu's power was gone. The man, who had worked for Wu for 9 years and done many dangerous jobs for him, placed a thick ivory envelope on the desk. It had no stamp or return address, just a single black seal pressed into the back, a wolf's eye. "What are you doing?" Gene Wu asked, his voice shaking. "Leaving," the man said simply. Gene Wu tried to offer him more money, promising to double his pay, but the man just shook his head. He was not negotiating, he was finished. "There isn't a number for this," he said quietly, looking at the black seal on the envelope. Not for him. Within the hour, the rest of Wu's guards followed. By noon, the massive penthouse that usually held 12 people was empty and silent, except for Wu and a young lawyer who didn't know any better. Gene Wu sat in his expensive chair, staring at the envelope. For the first time in 15 years, the man who thought he was untouchable was truly afraid. Gene Wu opened the ivory envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single piece of paper with no signature, just a time and a location. At the bottom were 4 words that made his skin turn cold: "Come alone or don't." Wu had spent his whole life being the one who gave orders, but now he sat in his empty penthouse, truly afraid. The meeting place was a large, expensive restaurant that was usually full of people, but tonight it was dark and silent. Wu arrived early, telling himself it was a choice, but he knew he was just desperate. Exactly at the time written in the note, Malik Dio walked through the front doors. He didn't have a team of guards or a weapon in his hand. He was just a tall man in a dark jacket who moved through the empty room like he owned it. Malik sat down across the table from Gene Wu and said nothing. He just watched Wu with a kind of patience that was scarier than any threat. Wu broke first, just as Malik knew he would. "You've made your point," Wu said, trying to sound brave. "Name a number. We can settle this quietly." Malik didn't answer with words. Instead, he placed a tablet on the table and turned it toward Wu. He pressed play. The video showed the ICU hallway from the day before, and the footage was crystal clear. Wu watched himself demand the room and then saw his own hand strike Annie's face. He saw her stagger back and put her hand over her stomach to protect her baby. He saw her shaking as she picked up her papers while he simply fixed his cufflink. Malik paused the video and let the silence fill the room. "I don't want your money," Malik said in a quiet, unhurried voice. "And I don't want an apology." He slid a thick stack of papers across the table. Every page was already marked for Wu to sign. "You hit my sister," Malik said, leaning forward just a little. 7 months pregnant, in the middle of her job. "Sign it." Wu looked at the papers and realized what they were. They were documents that would take away everything he owned. His buildings, his companies, and his properties. Malik told him that if he didn't sign, the video would be sent to every news reporter and business partner who mattered. And then, Malik promised, he would come back. Wu picked up the pen, finally understanding the difference between having money and having true power. Malik had always had the protection Annie needed. 3 weeks later, the hospital looked the same, but it felt completely different. One morning, the name, Gene Wu International, had been taken down from the front of the building. New signs were put up, and every staff member received a message saying the hospital was under new ownership. The memo promised that everyone would keep their jobs and receive better pay. Priya had called Annie crying with joy, and even Dr. Harlan Cole had sent a text saying he was sorry and should have done better. Annie hadn't replied yet. She had more important things to focus on. Annie was back in the hospital, but this time she was the patient. The room was warm, the lights were soft, and the monitors hummed quietly. She held her daughter against her chest and simply breathed. The baby weighed 6 pounds and 4 ounces, with a full head of dark curls and the loudest cry Annie had ever heard. For the first time in a long time, Annie felt completely safe. The door opened quietly and Malik entered. He didn't make a sound, moving through the room with the same calm grace he always had. He stopped at the foot of the bed and looked at the tiny baby. Annie reached out and held her daughter toward him. Malik sat down and took the small child into his large hands. The man who had destroyed a billionaire's empire in a single night became completely soft as he looked at her. "She looks like Mama," he said quietly. Annie smiled, knowing he was right. Across the city, the cold rain was falling again, just as it had on the day Annie was fired. Sio Gene Wu stood on the sidewalk outside a building that no longer belonged to him. He had no expensive car waiting, no guards in suits, and no money left in his accounts. He was just a man in the rain who had run out of buildings to buy. He looked up at the new sign one last time, turned up his collar against the cold, and walked away into the dark. The rain did not care about him at all. Back in the warm room on the 4th floor, the baby settled deeper into her uncle's arms and went back to sleep. She had no idea what her last name would mean one day, but she would eventually learn. Annie's story ended here. She had never needed a hero to save her, she just needed her brother to help her finish the fight she had started on her own.